I gave Pat the choice in something on Douglas MacArthur or something on Valley Forge. Both of which growing up, I got to know. My dad was a young man and was on a place called Bataan when World War II broke out. He, being smarter than the average person, he was up in the mountains advising the Filipinos on how to use artillery as a corporal. By the time the surrender notice came, by the time he got back to Bataan, to Marveles, the march had started, and Dad just looked down and said, "That's just not me." Hid out for a while with the Filipinos, and then they got him out, and he fought the rest of the war as what he always was, an artilleryman. Believe me, that man bled red. Which is one reason my son went that way. I always looked at it this way: you can't get a cannon hooked up to your parachute and get out the door. And those big things attract attention, just like tanks. Ugly people like me, I had my briefing book, some of y'all saw. And I used to be a whole lot skinnier, about as ugly as I am now. I appreciate being asked to come down. Seeing Ernie, Paul Longweir, Paul and I spent 7 months in Honduras in 1990 something. It was a ball. Am I working?
Yeah.
You're not working.
No, it's working.
Oh, it is?
Hold it up. Keep it up.
All right, keep it up here?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's enough about me. I started in Vietnam, retired after I got back from Afghanistan. I was the chief of plans over there in 2004 and 5 when we were winning. If you want to blame anybody in the world about why we're not still winning, go to Foggy Bottom and see your local State Department. If you ever want me to come back, I'll tell you all about it. But we're here to talk about Doug MacArthur. Doug MacArthur was a genius, and like most of them, flawed. MacArthur only spoke in the third person. When asked why the Japanese, he kept maintaining that the Philippines would be the Gibraltar, much larger of course, of the Pacific. Because the Japanese would never invade, they were afraid of MacArthur. His chief of intelligence, Charles Willoughby, agreed with him, as did his whole staff. George Catlett Marshall, one of our great men, characterized MacArthur's staff as a bunch of toadies. He also called Doug Pinky's son. Most folks don't realize that the 4 years MacArthur spent at West Point, his mother, the wife of a 3-star general at the time, lived across the street. What? She had her own intelligence network. She had a file on every man that graduated from West Point. When World War I broke out, she decided that Doug had to be part of the Pershing staff, and she blackmailed Fox Connor, at that time Pershing's deputy, into giving him the assignment he got, which is not unknown in that circle. She went as far as to eliminate officers that were in her son's way. Unique way to do it, and she had some very unique ways. Now, most of my references about the Philippines are going to come from this book. It's the Army Green Book. There's a whole series of them that were done after World War II. The odd thing about this is there's criticism of Douglas MacArthur, which is kind of odd because it was written while he was still a 5-star general. Your entire problem in the Philippines revolved around 3 circumstances. Number 1, MacArthur had to be gotten out of the United States after the Bonus Army debacle where he gunned down the World War I veterans, and once again irritated a senator who later played a large portion in his life, a senator named Harry Truman. Now, most folks do not realize that in World War I, MacArthur tried to court-martial Harry Truman. Didn't know that, did you? Wonderful webs we weave. Harry Truman, as most people know from the movies and his biography, commanded an artillery unit for the 30, try that fast, sober, 35th Infantry Division. He was assigned to provide covering fire to the 84th Brigade, which at that time was commanded by MacArthur. They weren't doing anything. Their neighboring unit was getting the crap kicked out of them. Harry Truman moved his guns 300 meters, and MacArthur went to Pershing. Notice he didn't go to the division commander, he went to Pershing, and wanted to court-martial him for willful disobedience, negligence, and about 9 things, revolving around the fact that Harry moved his guns 300 meters without MacArthur's permission. That's how he said it. Saved the battalion that was in trouble. And Pershing looked at him and said, "Dougie, shut up. Get out of my headquarters and never come back." John Joseph Pershing despised the man. Now, during World War I, when he was the assistant division commander of the 42nd Rainbow Division, he used to like to drive up to the front wearing his fancy hat, his pipe, his sunglasses, his trench coat, and get up on the parapet and look at the German lines. Nothing wrong with that, is there? Except the German forward observers would see the hat, the pipe, and they would artillery the lines he was at. By that time, he had left. He did that once too often to 165th New York Infantry. Anybody know who they are? The Fighting Irish, my granddad's unit. He had been in the British Army, got invalided out after Ypres, came over and joined our army so he could become a citizen. Yes, I'm the grandson of a wetback. But it was the St. Lawrence, not the Rio Grande. He came back one day, and the fellow who was at that time commanding the 165th New York, anybody know the name? Wild Bill Donovan. He told MacArthur, "If you get one more of my men killed, I'll shoot you here myself, and none of these Irish lads will squeal on me." Does that might explain why the OSS was not permitted to operate in the southwest area of the Pacific? That's Doug MacArthur. Was he a genius? Was Inchon a genius move? Yes. The 3 landings on New Guinea, which nobody ever heard of, will relieve pressure on Australia. Genius, yes. But he was flawed. He was a small man. Now why, with nearly 100,000 troops, adequate supplies for 4 months, did the Philippines fall? Well, first, they weren't ready for the Lingayen landings because Japanese would never invade. Now remember, they didn't have satellites, they didn't have SR-71s, U-2s, P-38s filled with cameras. They relied on intelligence. The other thing is, Doug MacArthur was asked one time by Claire Booth Luce, somewhat of a famous reporter, what his strategy were for the offense. He outlined a perfect offense, invasion of Formosa, etc., etc. He was asked, what have you got to defend the Pacifics? What do you think about defending the Philippines? That would mean defeat. His comment, not mine. So what happened? In September of 1941, the Orange Plan, which had been the plan for the defense of the Philippines for decades, I guess, was scrapped. Why? Because Churchill and Roosevelt agreed that Europe would be the primary theater should we enter the war. Unfortunately, they told that to MacArthur. The new Rainbow 5 said basically, Doug, hold out as long as you can, ain't nothing headed your way. And nothing did. But three things, changed the picture. Number one, Pearl Harbor, which nobody expected, especially our Navy. That probably was the worst move the Japanese made. They sank the gun club. The Japanese American battleship admirals were beached. And young men like Halsey, Spruance, who was not an aircraft carrier guy, by the way, and others took over, Mark Michener, etc. Had they hit the fuel farms and the dry docks, the carriers would have been out of action. However, they hit the battleships, which meant you can't run convoys without battleships back then, because at that time in the war, they still had not accepted the aircraft carrier as the capital ship. So, MacArthur, who at that time had the largest air force in our military, people always wonder what happened. He had the largest air force. I have the entire TO&E for it right there. He had 107 P-40s. That was more than anybody except Chenault. He only had 99, but he had 6 he had stolen from the British, which we won't go into. I like Claire Chenault. He had a majority of our B-17s. He had the first 25 A-20 Havocs made. He had an adequate Air Force that could have done a good job had they ever got off the ground. 12 hours after Pearl Harbor, his entire Air Force was, nearly the entire Air Force was parked wingtip to wingtip on 3 fields. Because Sutherland, his chief of staff, wouldn't let them take off because MacArthur at that time was planning how he was going to bomb Formosa. And even after the second air raid warning, anybody got any bourbon? Was made, Sutherland would not give permission for the fighters nor the bombers to scramble. They had 32 auxiliary fields. The second thing that caused the fall of the Philippines was MacArthur's demand that USAFE, United States Armed Forces Far East, be set up, which meant that General Sharp, who was on Mindanao with 30,000 troops, very little fighting, and adequate supplies, could not say, I'm not part of the main command when Jonathan Wainwright surrendered it. The second thing, he figured the way to break up the Rainbow Five plan was, I'll make 70,000 troops hostages. I'll put on the Bataan Peninsula and dare Marshall not to send me stuff. Didn't work. MacArthur, until he went to Pearl Harbor, July 42, did not believe our fleet had been sank. He honestly believed that Roosevelt and Marshall were keeping supplies from him. So he put everybody on Bataan. Those of us who fought in Vietnam, what could 30,000 trained and semi-trained Philippine guerrillas done to the Japanese from Lingayen Bay to Manila? When they were carrying M1s and O3s and the Japanese had Nambus and Arikas. Think about it, 30,000 trained guerrillas to cover from Lingayen Bay, try it in English, the north part of the Philippines to get to Manila. What could they have done on Mindanao, Cebu, all the islands? Why weren't they turned loose? Because MacArthur said, that is not the proper kind of war for us to fight. He told Donovan that the reason he wasn't allowed to bring his guys in was because you can't fight a guerrilla war in the Philippines. Which is kind of funny because he was shot at when he was in the Philippines briefly visiting his father, who was the military governor. Is that even starting to sound familiar? Those of us who are in Vietnam, how many of the conventional forces never figured out how guerrillas fought? I wrote an entire, I wrote an entire paper on it. It's called Adaptive Warriors. It's a lot of fun to read. General Mulholland, at that time, the USASOC commander, told me to write something with an attitude, because at that time the conventional army was trying to take some of our missions. I far exceeded his expectations. When he read it, he threw me out of his office. He said, I can't take this to a meeting with 14 three-star generals. I said, okay, we'll take out one of them, take it home with 13. He threw me out of his office again. I mean, literally. Some of the guys, I know Ernie's met John Mulholland. He's a big guy. But they could not figure out how MacArthur to let his boys go. Now, who did he have on Bataan? Did we have incompetent generals on Bataan? Anybody read about these guys? King, Smith, Parker, Skinny Wainwright? Every one of those guys was a fighter. Parker said, let me take between Lingayen Gulf and north of the Philippines to Manila, there's only 2 places you can actually deploy armor and good artillery. All of them said, let us just take our forces north and we'll just hit and run all the way back. There are ravines on that place. You can blow up the bridge. You can drop elephants and not hear them hit the bottom. No, we're going to go to Bataan. And 70,000 American and Filipinos surrendered. That lesson should be taught. Because in Afghanistan, I'll tell one story, can I? In Afghanistan, the general commanding the conventional forces decided that our guys on the border were the ditch. Sound familiar, Ernie? Paul? Long, I guess along the west or east, one of the two. Should be function any more than 2 kilometers from their base camps. The base camps were 10 kilometers apart. And they were on the main infiltration routes from Pakistan. Help you out any on this one? They just walked on through. Finally, sounder heads prevailed, opened it up, we started killing bad guys. The rules of engagement today are very simple in Afghanistan. Just throw this out. If you shoot a guy who's shooting at you, you're probably going to be court-martialed. I am not being facetious. That is the rules of engagement. A 15-6 will be launched if you shoot a guy shooting at you. You can bet your sweet, you can bet on it. We've lost more people in the last 3 years than we did in the first 7. And people don't realize that. It's not in the paper every day, damn. But the fact is, MacArthur's mistakes. Now remember, we always train for the last war. Which is why in World War I, people sent men over the top in the machine gun fire. Because the last time they did this, we're still using cockback percussion rifles. This is a learning experience. If you ever wanted to, I've been on Bataan. Went there as a civilian, I'm not that old. I've been to 3 places. I was born at Valley Forge, and I spent a lot of my life there. Should you ever want to feel like an American, sit outside the chapel at Valley Forge, either early in the morning or right before twilight, and listen. Just listen. Last year we had our convention at the Alamo. I sat there, it was 2 blocks from the hotel. I went over and sat there. Were you with, no, were you with me that night we sat there? And we just listened. You could hear America. When I walked what became Bataan Death March Trail, I actually thought, I know if I stopped, I'd hear it again. Unfortunately, I was AWOL and didn't take the time. I'll get back. But read about it. It is the same tragedy that we faced in Vietnam, we faced in Korea. The political battle between MacArthur, Truman, Marshall was just as big a battle as it was with Johnson and Nixon versus Frank Church, McGovern, Jane What's-Her-Face, and the rest of the crowd. We don't learn. One thing we have learned. George Bush Sr. did it. When we went Desert Storm, we took the Guard and Reserve with us. Because the regular Army belongs to the country. The Guard and Reserve belong to the towns. I will give you one illustration and I'll shut up and get out of here. The main paper in Dallas, Texas, during Desert Storm was raising Cain about the war, how terrible it was and everything else, how bad it was being fought, etc. Until the 36th Infantry Brigade, the Texas National Guard, came home. Within 4 days, the entire attitude of that newspaper changed. Now why would that be? 4,906 National Guardsmen. Won't bore you with the numbers, but when you do exponentials on parents, grandparents, uncles, aunts, friends, the kids to the guy that's the principal of the high school, basically 5,000 troops will influence somewhere between 100 and 125,000 people directly or indirectly. Think about it. This war, our generation, made sure this generation didn't come home the wrong way. Both my sons, they were in Iraq when I was in Afghanistan. Both of them came back and they said, "Dad, wish you'd had a parade." I said, "Didn't need one. I was Special Forces. We sneak out, we sneak back. If we had parades, we know we're in trouble. They knew we were there." We have a poster that says, "Don't thank me. I wasn't here and this didn't happen." Remember Che Guevara? I gotta do this. I can't help myself. Remember Che Guevara? The guy, the kid's wearing a t-shirt? He was killed in 1967 by the Bolivian police. Right. Disappeared. Never heard of again until 3-4 years ago now, when they found him. Scared the heck out of Castro. What if he went over? What if he's telling everything? Contrast that to Bin Laden. I'll leave it at that. Gentlemen, pardon me, ladies, I'm not used to having ladies in the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope something I told you was fun, informative. If not, throw rocks at him, he invited me. Thank you so much.
Jack, we thank you very much for coming, and on behalf of the Atlanta Vietnam Veterans Business Association, we'd like to give you one of our challenge coins.
Thank you.
And also, you'll probably recognize something about the 5th Special Forces. Thank you, buddy.
I hate to say it, that was the best looking flash. You gotta admit it, guys. And by the way, the general is wrong. That's not the Vietnamese flag. Surprised everybody, right? Because the 5th, the black flash, took over for the 1st and 7th, yellow and red. And with that, I rest my case.
All right, Jack, you thank you so much for coming.